accent, living.
يعطيكم العافية. أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. شكرا أستاذ أحمد على حضورك معنا وتطوعك لتعطينا this session. We are very happy to have you. تفضل عرفنا عن نفسك لو سمحت.
Of course, with pleasure. Thank you very much for hosting me virtually. I hope everybody's doing well with what we can say is the end of COVID-19. That's what we hope, at least, fingers crossed. I hope everybody's doing well, and your families and your professional life has not been affected so much. Definitely it has been impacted, but we hope things will start to pick up soon and we will see the end of this pandemic. I will tell you a little bit about myself. I don't know if I should start by saying my name, but there you go. My name is Ahmed Towman. Towman is a very odd name. I know some of you might be wondering, what is it? I have no clue. Some people say we come from Turkish descent, but if you see me and my dark skin, I think that's very unlikely. So as we were saying at the beginning, I was born in Cairo, but I grew up and went to school in the UAE, specifically in the lovely city of Abu Dhabi, the mesmerizing city of Abu Dhabi, which I can't leave for some reason. I did my undergrad studies in Egypt. Well, I started in Egypt, and then I joined L.L.C faculty in MIU, Misr International University, and then I was awarded a scholarship to continue my further studies in Canada, in a lovely place called Prince Edward Island. For those of you who might know where that is, it's a remote island on the eastern coast of Canada. A lovely place to be. I spent around 2 years there, and then I came back to where I belong, to UAE, and I finished my postgrad studies also in interpreting. So I have a master's in interpreting and translation from the American University in Sharjah. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. I have been working as a conference interpreter for a while. However, I stopped being a freelancer and I joined an organization that is affiliated to the Ministry of Interior here in the UAE. I am currently the head of the translation and interpreting department at that organization. We work, of course, with the policing sector a lot, so that's my main background, policing and security. However, I still do conference interpreting every now and then, whenever there's an opportunity. It's like my desire, my hidden secret that I go to every now and then to just get back into that norm. Now with COVID-19, I started to do a lot of remote interpreting, which we might get a chance to talk about sometime today. The objective or the aim of today's session, I had a discussion with Ms. Zainab about what can we do, and knowing that a lot of you or most of you are actually working interpreters and what could be useful. I think we will, first of all, we will touch upon some key concepts around interpreting, simultaneous interpreting in specific, working in a conference interpreting setting. And then immediately we will move into some self-assessment techniques and self-development techniques. These are things that I got from my academic background. Don't worry, it's not going to be boring. I tried as much as possible to make it to the point. So no boring academia, but just taking what's useful for it from it and trying to build that on to come up with ways where we can assess ourselves and assess others. At the end, we will have a mini practice session. The objective will not be to practice interpreting per se, but to practice giving feedback to others and evaluating your own performance as a simultaneous interpreter working in a conference setting. So that's it in a nutshell. If you allow me, Ms. Zainab, I'm going to share my screen now to open the PowerPoint slides. Let's see. Don't worry, there's just 50 slides. No, just kidding. Killed by PowerPoint, hopefully not. So there we are. So we talked about what we will be doing. Hi, Amin, lovely to see you. Um, so before we get into self-development, I want to spend a few moments to talk about what is unique or what is special about working in a conference setting. So I know most of you, or I think the majority here, are interpreters working in the States. Presumably, I would say I'm making assumptions here. Please stop me if I'm completely derailed, that you are working in community interpreting, like healthcare interpreting and court interpreting, and so on. Now, in order to make a transition into conference interpreting, there are a number of characteristics that we can say are unique to conference setting. The good news is the transition is going to be easy. So it's easy to move from community interpreting to conference interpreting, not the other way around. And that is because you already are working in what could be classified as a high risk context. So working in a court, working in a hospital, working with lawyers, with victims, or whatever it is, refugees, this is considered a high risk context. When you move into the conference, obviously the risk is still there, but there aren't someone's life at stake, for example, or a patient, or someone who might be in damage for a misinterpretation. Now, that's one aspect. The other aspect that is unique to conference interpreting is the novelty that we get. And this is a good thing about working in a conference setting, actually, because every day, as for those of you who have done conference interpreting or are doing conference interpreting, it's not, no two events are the same. So unlike working in a hospital every day, and perhaps even if you're working in different clinics or different medical specializations, but you're still within that or this parameter of a hospital. This is not the case with a conference setting, because every day is new. You've got a new theme, new subject matter, new materials, new people, new experts from different fields. So that novelty is, to me, what makes conference interpreting so special. Now, you've got the word recurring here, and what I mean by that is, although the subjects are very diverse, however, you might notice that these conferences that you attend this year are probably going to be held the same next year, and so on and so forth. So for example, we've got in Abu Dhabi, right before COVID, we had the Sustainability Summit, and that event is an ongoing event. So every year, almost around the same period of the year, around March or April, we've got that Sustainability Summit. So the good news here is that if you work in that event this year and you take notes and you make your glossaries and terminology and everything, by next year you will be ready for the same kind of event. Different speakers and different subjects, of course, but you're still getting into that kind of experience. So we talked about the low risk, and again, I have the word relatively here because there is still some conferences that will be considered high risk. We'll talk more about those if you want. And these, for example, are things around anything around security, anything around diplomats, or yeah, I think those are the two major like high risk conference types: security and diplomatics. Also, what you get in a conference setting, which might not be there in the healthcare interpreting or in court interpreting, is the peer support. So you always work with a booth mate. This is really good because, to me, my booth mate is my mate. That's why they're called booth mates, because they support you in so many ways that you just, it feels odd if you have to do consecutive again, for example, on your own, because you get so used to working within that teamwork atmosphere. The other thing is the material availability. Again, most conferences you will be able to receive, if you ask the right questions and if you put it in a way that is acceptable to the vendor or to the client that you're working with, probably you will be given some materials to look through in advance or even on the day of the conference. The time factor is also another aspect that is unique to conference interpreting, because most of the time you get a chance ahead of time. So you get at least 2 or 3 days, even 1 day to prepare. Unlike, for example, medical interpreting, where you are always on the call and you have to respond, for example, in an hour or even less sometimes. The reachability is another thing. So even during the conference, you have people, a select of people that you can potentially identify and reach out to them for help. Those are event organizers, technicians, and other people who can, help you support the overall process. So these are some just key things about working in a conference setting. Now, before we move into self-assessment and self-development, I think it is worthwhile going a step backwards and just talking a little bit or touching a little bit on the process of simultaneous interpreting. Now, I don't want to get into a lot of details about how that happens, because you probably know, as simultaneous or as consecutive interpreters, you know what the process is, but it's just worthwhile going, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the process of interpreting, or simultaneous interpreting in specific. Now, this model that you're seeing in front of you is done, or has been developed by Colonimus, and as you can see, 1992. That's quite a while. However, it is still very valid in my point of view, because it covers the whole sphere of the interpreting process. And according to the model, there are a number of considerations that you have to bear in mind when you're doing simultaneous interpreting. And those are, as you can see on the screen, process skills, process management, linguistic, and so on and so forth. So very quickly, what do we mean by process skills? This is simply your ability to receive and so comprehend, understand, and construct renditions or words or ideas, as you can see. The second thing is process management. So this is basically your ability to, as interpreters, to listen and to think, retain information, and produce all at the same time. This is different for consecutive interpreting, because you do them separately. So you listen, and then you take time to formulate and take notes, and then you produce. But in simultaneous, they're all kind of mixed up. The next component is the linguistic and cultural competence. And here it refers to the mastery of both source and target language, as well as your understanding of the cultural setting that you're working in. So as you may know, it's never enough to just know the language, but you have to know all the other components and elements around a certain culture. The next component is knowledge, and this refers to the interpreter's prior knowledge. This includes things, your knowledge about the word, about what's happening around you, your knowledge about a particular field. Maybe you come from a background that is not related to interpreting. Maybe you're a lawyer and you're using that prior knowledge and building it into the process. Preparation, we're going to talk a lot about that, but I think it's clear, it needs no explanation. The environment, this refers to both the physical environment that you're in, whether it's a conference setting or a healthcare setting or any other setting, court interpreting setting, for example, as well as the non-physical environment, which is for example, the political sphere that you're into, or the cultural sphere that you're into. And the last thing is the filters. And this is your ability to filter out any biases, any beliefs, any personal habits, for example, or other things that you think might interfere or make you intervene in the interpreting process. So that's very a simple, sorry, I don't know how to remove this explanation for the interpreting process. Now, before we get into quality, assessing quality and assessing performance and interpreting, I just want to share with you this very interesting quotation that is from Riccardi, and it says that interpreting is something evanescent, which vanishes as soon as it's performed. What remains are the impressions received by the audience. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this is before we talk about assessing, interpreting, and evaluating your performance, we really need to understand why is it difficult to do so. So unlike other products and other industries, you know, where, for example, you have an end tangible product to assess. For example, if you're in architecture, you would have a building to assess, and you can judge, for example, by the way that the building is erect, if it's designed properly, or if it's not balanced, or whatever it is. So you have something physical and something tangible. The same applies to even the profession of doctors. Let's talk about doctors. The metric to judge whether or not a doctor is, you know, efficient is if a patient is healed. Obviously, that's not true, but you get the point. The same applies to lawyers. A lawyer would be deemed a successful lawyer if he wins the case. Now, when it comes to interpreting, though, it becomes a little bit tricky because there isn't really a clear, tangible metric that we can use to say that the interpreter is competent or not. The only thing is the audience who are receiving the interpretation for them to say that. But that's even still inaccurate, because even the audience who you are interpreting for are in no position to tell you that your interpretation is correct, because they don't understand the source language. So I just wanted to share this part and keep it in the back of your mind to know that our profession, by definition, is hard to measure. It's very hard to measure success in interpreting, or to judge what is a good interpretation and what is not. And sorry, my don't know what happened to my screen. It froze. Can you see my screen? Anyone? Oh yeah, there you go. So we'll move on to talk about quality assessment and how it started. So just I think an interesting piece of information that I came across is that our profession is novel or new by definition. So I mean, conference interpreting has only been there for a couple of decades. It's not like other professions that have long-standing periods of time and they have been there for forever, like physicians or like lawyers or like teachers. No, conference interpreting is pretty much a new profession. And therefore, there isn't much academic research to judge or to provide that basis for judging performance. And based on the research, it was actually shown that interpreters often judge themselves or judge others based on their own beliefs. So it was a subjective process. So there's always been that belief that because we are interpreters, we know our profession, so only us can judge how good or bad we are. And that, of course, is based on a subjective view. So for example, if I ask you about a performance of a colleague of yours whom you've heard interpreting, you might say, okay, he or she is a good interpreter. But if I ask you another question and say, why is he or she a good interpreter? This is where the gray area will start to appear. Because, okay, some would say, well, they get the message across effectively. But then if I ask another question and say, okay, why or how did you know that they get the message across effectively? You would say, okay, maybe they got the sense or the background or the context correctly, or they used the right terminology. So in other words, there aren't a clear set of criteria to say that this is a good interpreter, this is a not so good interpreter. Now, also, what we come to realize is that us as interpreters, we always have high expectations for ourselves. And this means that we are setting high standards also for ourselves, unlike the end user. And there has been that shift in paradigm from focusing on the interpreter to assess themselves into focusing on the end user or the client. So instead of going to interpreters and say, okay, can you evaluate your own performance? We go to the client and we ask them, what did you think of that interpretation. So we're moving from that subjectivity to using a more evidence-based approach into the evaluation of performance. Now, we're going to move now to what are some of the criteria that can be used to assess performance into simultaneous interpreting. These are findings from a survey that was done by the Center of Translation Studies in University of Vienna. So they have done a survey. They have sent an anonymous survey to all AFAQ members. So you're familiar with AFAQ, the Association for not professional, for conference interpreting. And they basically asked them questions about what do you think are the important criteria for assessing performance in simultaneous, and they came up with this, these criteria as the most important for interpreter performance. Now they have segmented them or classified them into three main segments. Those are content-related criteria, form-related criteria, and the last one is delivery-related criteria. Now, what do we mean by each of those? Let's go through them and see, okay, there are probably things that you already know and use to assess yourself or assess others. But I think having them laid out in this order is really helpful because it will help us later on deciding what kind of exercises or what kind of practice we need to do in order to address each and every one of those individually, rather than to train in a holistic way. So the first one is obviously the consistency of sense or idea with the original. And so what's between brackets is my addition to it. So in other words, it's the authenticity of the message. So for example, if the speaker says the UN and the EU are doing a great job in combating COVID-19 pandemic, if this is the example. Now, in order to judge that the interpretation is authentic or that the sense is consistent with the original, the interpreter would have to render that into, for example, الأمم المتحدة والاتحاد الأوروبي يقومان بدور مميز جدا أو عمل بارز في مجابهة أو مكافحة فيروس أو جائحة COVID-19. If anything is flouted, for example, if they say بدل الأمم المتحدة يقول المترجم I don't know شو اسمه المجلس الأوروبي, for example, instead of الأمم المتحدة, then there is a problem with authenticity. The second one is the logical cohesion, or in other words, the glue, the link between each idea and the other idea. Now, this is also a little bit problematic because sometimes the cohesion is dependent on the speaker. So sometimes the speaker is not making sense. So it's hard for the interpreter to actually also make sense. I'm sure all of you have been put into that position where the speaker himself is not really coherent or cohesive. So you can't be also that. The third one, or the third criterion, is the completeness or the intactness. Now, if we go back to the same example we've given a minute ago, the EU or the UN and the EU are doing a great job to combat COVID-19. If, for example, the interpreter says only the UN or only the EU and not both, then obviously there's a problem with completeness. Now, moving on to the second category, which are form-related criteria. As you can see, the first one is using the correct terminology, or in other words, being accurate in the use of jargon or in the use of specific words in a certain industry. So again, using the same example, if the interpreter, for example, instead of saying COVID-19 pandemic, instead of saying جائحة مثلا قال وباء أو مرض. Okay, so that means they're not using the correct or the most accurate jargon or terminology. The second criterion in the formulated segment is correct grammar. Now, to me, this is actually not so much, when I'm assessing interpreters, to me, this comes at a later um, importance or significance. So unless the grammar is so messed up that it made the sense not authentic or not cohesive or not complete, then grammar wouldn't be so much important. Of course, we're not saying that you should go out and make mistakes, but again, because of the cognitive load that could be placed on simultaneous interpreting, that is often we're being more lenient while giving feedback to ourselves and to others when it comes to grammar. The last one in the form-related criteria is using the appropriate style or the register. Now, this refers, for example, if the speaker is being too formal and delivering a speech, for example, for the UN, and the interpreter is using a low register language to render that, for example, using a little bit of Ammiya or colloquial, or not using the same level of articulation or articulateness, if there's such a word. I think I just made up a word, but anyways, you get the point. Moving on to delivery related criteria. And I think, to me, these are very, very important when it comes to working in a conference setting. Again, unlike court interpreting or healthcare interpreting or community interpreting, where the message is the most and perhaps the last important thing, in a conference setting, you would find that delivery related criteria are raised a little bit in importance. And this is obviously because in a conference that goes from 8 to 5, people talking about, whatever subject it is, sustainability or energy or even policing. At the end of the day, the end user or the client, what they want to hear is proper, smooth, calm delivery. We're not saying, again, that you should ignore the other criteria that we talked about, but really, when you work in a conference setting, these become really, really important. So let's go through them. The first one is fluency of delivery, and here we refer to the flow. So there is no stuttering, the interpreter is not pausing for no reason, or just there's that natural flow of ideas. The second one is the lively intonation. And to me, this sounds a little bit musical. So to me, it's like keeping up the tempo. So you're not following a monotonous tone. You're putting emphasis in the right places. You're raising and lowering your voice whenever needed and according to the speaker, if they're trying to deliver a certain point. The third one, which is my favorite, is having a pleasant voice. I was once told that, and this was by one of my fellow colleagues who is a very renowned interpreter in the UAE. I'm not going to mention his name for obvious reasons, but he once told me that having a pleasant voice and delivering the message in a pleasant and just nice, appealing way to the audience is sometimes what the end user or the client considers a good interpreter to be. Now, this might be frustrating to interpreters because at the end, I don't want people, I'm not singing, right? I'm delivering interpretation, but this is the truth when you're working in a conference setting. Sometimes people judge a good interpreter based on how pleasant their voice is. And I'm going to give you a personal example. I mean, most of the times when people come to me in the booth and they maybe want to compliment or say nice words about my performance, most of the times I notice that they comment on the voice. They say, oh, I like the way that your voice sounds. Now, obviously, I have a different voice when I interpret, not this voice, but you get the point. So try to focus also on developing a pleasant kind of voice when you're delivering. The fourth element or the fourth criterion is synchronicity. Oh my God, I trained so much in saying this word. So to be basically working in synchronicity with the speaker. So in other words, you're not lagging much. When the speaker finishes their utterance, you are expected to finish your utterance as well, like seconds or even fractions of a second after they do so. We always find this hilarious when, for example, a speaker is giving a joke and everybody's laughing except the people who are listening to the interpreter because they're still waiting for the interpretation. So you don't want to put yourself there. You have to make sure that you're constantly following up with them, and the décalage or the delay in delivering your interpretation is not so much. This obviously improves with practice, and it depends on the context and the difficulty of the speaker you're working with. The last and perhaps least important, according to the AFAQ members, in terms of importance for the delivery related criteria, is the having that native accent or the sounding original in the target language that you're delivering into. Again, the sad truth, especially in perhaps the region that I work into, and I want to give you insight into that. Sometimes interpreters are judged based on their accents, whether it is in English or even in Fusha. يعني أحيانا يفضلون المترجم أو يعتبرون أن المترجم الناجح هو الذي يتحدث بعربية سليمة حتى وإن لم يكن ينقل كل ما يقال بشكل سليم. وهو, at the end, like we said, the client is the one receiving the service. Now, very cautious we have to be again. We're not saying that you should jeopardize other criteria, but bear in mind that the end user or the client really gives importance to these minute details. Moving on to self-development techniques. So now we talked about the criteria. Let's talk a little bit about how we can improve or develop these our performance in these areas of competence. Now, we're all familiar with shadowing, of course. We can talk all night about shadowing, but to me, I think shadowing is an all-inclusive. I think I mentioned it here. Yeah, there you go. So we'll do that first, and we talk about shadowing, just to make sure that everybody knows, for example, first of all, what we're talking about. So shadowing is the exercise that you do where you basically listen to a given speech and you repeat immediately what is said with the same pitch, the same tone, the same intonation, and you're basically following the shadow of the speaker. That's why it's called shadowing. Now, this exercise is very famous amongst those who have either studied or worked in interpreting. It is like our daily warm-up activity. Before you interpret, you just do it, just like athletes or footballers, for example, you know, do a round of running around the field before they get into the game. The same applies to simultaneous or conference interpreters. We do a bit of shadowing just to get our mind going. Now, I got this piece of academic finding just to show you how important this exercise is. And as you can see, shadowing involves around 80% of the neurolinguistic operations involved in simultaneous interpreting. Now, what does this mean? What this basically means is that when you practice shadowing, you are doing or you are performing almost 80% of the interpreting process. And that number is huge. If it's just, I mean, all you're doing is basically listening and saying whatever mimicking whatever the speaker is saying. But you can already see how impressive this can be and have a great impact on your performance. And judge upon it yourself. If you practice shadowing daily for a month, you would see a huge improvement in your own performance. Now, shadowing is not the only thing that you can do. Obviously, there are variations to shadowing. So there is delayed shadowing. And basically what this means is if you feel, okay, you know what, it's not doing it for me. It's very easy for me just to listen and to speak at the same time or speak right after the speaker, try to make it a little bit more challenging for yourself. So practice what is called delayed shadowing. And by that we mean is instead of immediately saying what the speaker or repeating what the speaker is saying, delay yourself for a second or a fraction of a second. So if the speaker starts to say, for example, in virus corona huwa jaiha, don't start yet until he finishes the word jaiha, and then you start saying that. So you will be lagging not one or two, but maybe three words behind the speaker. This will make it more difficult and obviously more rewarding for you, because it will improve your short-term memory, it will improve your split attention, it will improve so many things from the criterions that we talked about earlier. If that becomes easy, move to the next stage, and that is split attention shadowing or dual tasks. And by that, we simply refer to doing shadowing, but at the same time doing something else. So for example, do shadowing as normal, and then while doing that, try to write down anything that comes up to your mind. For example, numbers, write numbers from 1 to 100, or from 100 to 1, or try to even record your own ideas while practicing. This obviously will improve your cognitive processes and your ability to analyze and manipulate information all together, which is the key skill that you need while doing simultaneous. If that becomes easy, then move to the next stage, which is back shadowing. Now, I came up with this. I don't know if I actually came up with this like just few weeks ago, and it's not important. Sorry, it's not enough to just practice shadowing. It's really important for you as well to know if you're shadowing correctly, or if you're doing, because if you're not listening to your own performance, then you wouldn't have a way to assess or say that, okay, I did this right. So here, simply what you will do is that you will record your shadowing. So have a certain speech, listen to it, shadow it, and record it, and then listen to that recording and back shadow it. So shadow it again, in other words. And you will see that, okay, maybe it's not really, I didn't really get it right. So if you feel that that's not correct, go back to the original speech, shadow it, and then shadow your own shadowing. You will see that this will be a good exercise for you to know how you sound to the audience. And you always have to listen to that performance, putting in mind the end user or the client. The next technique is improvisation. And this is very helpful because it will help us with the sense consistency with the original, and also completeness, logical cohesion. So just a quick note, most of these exercises, they already cover the criteria that we talked about. And so for example, let's see. So shadowing, for example, covers consistency with original. It covers cohesion, it covers completeness, grammar, style, terminology, fluency, everything. So shadowing, that's why I called it an all-inclusive. On the other hand, improvisation will help you with keeping a nice flow, with watching your voice and your delivery and making sure you are calm. So what do we mean by improvisation? It's very simple. Take any subject and just try to talk about it for 2 minutes. If you feel that you can't, then basically you need to go and do more research about that subject, and then go ahead again and improvise and try to deliver a speech. So for example, imagine that you are the head of the WHO, and you're standing in front of the world and you're going to deliver a press release on the latest update around COVID-19. Now that's an easy one because most of us know. However, try to do that and really, really get into the character and improvise and try to record yourself and listen back to it. If you master that skill, then any problems that you might have with flow or stuttering or other problems around performance will automatically fade away. The last one is summarizing. So going the other way around. You listen to a certain speech. You're not asked to. You're not going to interpret. You are basically going to summarize what are the main or the key ideas that the speaker has talked about during his speech. This obviously helps us with the sense consistency and the completeness. So you will, if you manage to grasp all the ideas, the key ideas that the speaker has said, then you can say that your brain or your mind has managed to grasp the idea or the thought unit that the speaker has said. And now we move on to the practice session. So this is the end of me boring you out with my academic gibberish stuff, and it's time for us to do some practice. However, I want you, so now what's going to happen is you will be broken into rooms of 2. So you'll be paired with a colleague. I understand that from previous sessions, you get to choose your colleague. However, in order for me to take you out of your comfort zone, or put you in a discomfort zone rather, I will do that randomly. So I will ask Zoom to do that for me. So you will be placed with a colleague. Now, what I want you to do is basically, I'm going to give you this speech, the link to this speech, and I'm not going to give you any background about it whatsoever, just to replicate the real-time sort of ambiguity that we are put into in a conference setting or an interpreting setting in general. And I want you to start, first of all, by doing the first 2 minutes of the video to shadow it, and then 1 minute of delayed shadowing. And I just want to make sure we all understand what I mean by that. So you're not immediately saying what the speaker is saying, you're deliberately delaying yourself a little bit. And then the following 5 minutes, I just want you to start interpreting. Yeah. You can do the same 5 minutes. So if you, it doesn't matter if you, do shadowing for the first 5 minutes or the first, 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and then go back and do this, interpret the same part. It's completely up to you. But yeah, this is what we want you to do. Now, the other colleague, while listening to your colleague interpreting, I want you to use the criteria that we talked about, the form related and the performance related and the content related, to give feedback to your colleague after they're done. Obviously, don't interrupt them while they're interpreting. After they're done with their interpretation, or you can use your own, as long as you provide solid ground. So don't just say, for example, oh, I like your interpretation. Yeah, why? Right? So you can use these criteria, and please, obviously, always be constructive, whether you're assessing yourself. I like to be even hilarious with myself. Like, I hate listening to my own recording. I think everybody does. So, but always, it's really important for you to be positive when you give feedback to others, but also to yourself. I want you to record yourself if you can, because if I don't get to listen to every one of you, I'm happy to take these recordings and then give you individual feedback on them if we don't get a chance to listen to everybody. But I will be moving around the rooms just to maybe just listen and take notes and talk to you about it later on. And this point is really, really important. You need to listen to your own recording. So it's not enough to just record, interpret, and record, because unless you hear and you put yourself in the audience and the recipient place, there isn't really much development that is going on. I always say that we tend to be the best critics of our own selves. So we criticize ourselves because we know our areas of development, we know our gaps, we know our shortcomings. So listen to your own recording and give yourself some feedback. And obviously, this is a repetitive process, so it just keeps going. This is just some mini insights about self-development and some exercises that could be used. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So if Zainab now, Ms. Zainab can give me the go-ahead for the...
Okay. يعطيك العافية. Now we're gonna end the recorded session. so we can do the exercises. شكرا كتير وعن جد كانت محاضرة جدا قيمة.
My pleasure.
Okay, I'm gonna stop recording right now.